young woman, a hidden photograph, a message written in elegant script. The truth must be protected. When Eleanor Hartford stumbles upon a mysterious image buried in her grandmother's attic, she has no idea it will lead her to a long-buried scandal, and to a detective who may change her life forever. But what exactly was her grandmother hiding? And why did it matter so much, even decades later? Thank you so much for watching, and for all your comments. Let me know at the end if you liked the story, and where you're watching from, and why you're following this. The autumn rain fell in gentle sheets across Boston's cobblestone streets, turning the gas lamps into hazy beacons of amber light that stretched and blurred against the wet pavement. It was October of 1895, and the city carried the weight of its history in every brick and beam, in every whispered conversation that echoed through its narrow alleys and grand boulevards. Eleanor Hartford stood at the window of her late grandmother's townhouse on Beacon Hill, watching the rain trace delicate patterns down the glass, her reflection a ghostly apparition superimposed against the darkening street beyond. She had arrived 3 days prior from her home in Providence, summoned by her grandmother's solicitor to settle the estate. Eleanor was 26 years old, unmarried by choice rather than circumstance, with auburn hair that she wore pinned in the fashion of the day, and eyes the color of storm clouds that seemed to hold both intelligence and sadness in equal measure. Her grandmother, Constance Hartford, had been a formidable woman, a widow who had built a small fortune through shrewd investments and an unwavering determination that had been the talk of Boston society for decades. The house itself was a monument to that success, 3 stories of red brick with black shutters and a wrought iron fence that separated it from the street. Inside, the rooms were filled with the accumulated treasures of a long and prosperous life. Oil paintings in gilded frames, Persian rugs that muffled footsteps, mahogany furniture that gleamed with the patina of age and careful maintenance. Yet despite all this grandeur, there was a heaviness in the air, a sense of secrets kept and stories untold. Eleanor had spent the past 2 days sorting through papers and personal effects, a task made more difficult by the realization that she had never truly known her grandmother. Their relationship had been cordial but distant, marked by occasional visits and dutiful correspondence, but lacking in the warmth and intimacy that should have bound them together. Now, surrounded by the remnants of Constance's life, Eleanor felt a profound sense of loss, not just for the woman who had died, but for the connection they had never shared. It was on the 3rd day, while exploring the attic, that Eleanor made the discovery that would change everything. The attic was a vast space beneath the peaked roof, filled with trunks and boxes, dusty furniture covered in white sheets, and the accumulated detritus of decades. The air was thick with the smell of old wood and mothballs, and the only light came from a small dormer window that looked out over the rooftops of the neighboring houses. Eleanor had been working methodically through the space, cataloging the contents of each trunk and box, when she came upon a small leather case tucked behind a stack of hat boxes in the farthest corner. The case was unremarkable at first glance, the leather worn and cracked with age, the brass clasps tarnished to a dull brown. But something about it drew her attention, perhaps the way it had been hidden, pushed back into the shadows as if someone had wanted it to be forgotten. She carried it to the window, where the light was better, and carefully opened the clasps. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, was a collection of photographs. They were cabinet cards, the formal portraits that had been popular in the previous decade, mounted on thick cardboard backing and bearing the embossed names of various photographers from Boston and other cities. Eleanor lifted them out one by one, studying the faces that stared back at her with the solemn expressions typical of the era. Most of the photographs showed people she did not recognize, stern-faced men in dark suits, women in elaborate gowns with their hair piled high, children posed with uncomfortable formality. But it was the photograph at the bottom of the case that made Eleanor's breath catch in her throat. Unlike the others, this one was not a formal studio portrait, but rather a candid image, slightly blurred as if the subjects had been moving when the photograph was taken. The photograph showed 2 women standing in front of a house that Eleanor did not recognize. One of the women was clearly her grandmother, though younger than Eleanor had ever known her, perhaps in her early 30s. She wore a simple day dress and held a parasol, and there was a lightness in her expression that Eleanor had never seen in life. But it was the other woman who captured Eleanor's attention. She was roughly the same age as Constance, with dark hair and delicate features, and she was holding a baby in her arms. What made the photograph remarkable, however, was not the subjects themselves, but rather what had been written on the back. Eleanor turned the card over and found, in her grandmother's distinctive handwriting, a single line: Margaret and little Catherine, September 1887. The truth must be protected. Eleanor read the words again, her heart beginning to race. The truth must be protected. What truth? Who was Margaret? And who was little Catherine? She examined the photograph more closely, studying every detail: the architecture of the house in the background, the style of the women's clothing, the way the light fell across their faces. There was something about the image that suggested intimacy, a closeness between the two women that went beyond mere friendship. She spent the rest of the afternoon searching through the other contents of the attic, looking for any clue that might explain the photograph, but found nothing. The other photographs in the case offered no answers, and there were no letters or documents that mentioned either Margaret or Catherine. It was as if they had been deliberately erased from the historical record, leaving behind only this single image and its cryptic inscription. As evening fell and the rain continued to drum against the roof, Eleanor made a decision. She would not simply settle her grandmother's estate and return to Providence as planned. She would uncover the truth behind the photograph, discover who Margaret and Catherine were, and understand what secret her grandmother had been so determined to protect. It was a mystery that called to something deep within her, a need to understand not just her grandmother's past, but also her own place in the family's history. The next morning dawned clear and cold, the rain having passed during the night. Eleanor dressed carefully in a navy walking suit with a fitted jacket and a skirt that brushed the tops of her boots. She pinned her hat securely and gathered her gloves and reticule, then set out into the crisp autumn air. Her destination was the Boston Police Department headquarters on Pemberton Square, an imposing granite building that housed not only the city's police force but also a records department that she hoped might hold some clue to the mystery. The streets were busy with the morning traffic, horse-drawn carriages and wagons, pedestrians hurrying to their various destinations, newsboys calling out the headlines. Eleanor walked with purpose, her mind turning over the puzzle of the photograph. Why would her grandmother have hidden it away? What truth needed to be protected, and from whom? The questions multiplied with each step, but answers remained frustratingly out of reach. The police headquarters was a hive of activity when she arrived. Officers in their dark blue uniforms moved through the corridors with practiced efficiency, their voices echoing off the marble floors and high ceilings. Eleanor approached the front desk, where a sergeant with graying hair and a magnificent mustache looked up from his paperwork with an expression of polite inquiry. "Good morning, miss. How may I assist you?" His voice was gruff but not unkind, the accent distinctly Boston Irish. "Good morning, Sergeant. My name is Eleanor Hartford. I am hoping to access some historical records if that is possible. I am researching my family's history and have come across some questions that I believe your records might help to answer." The sergeant studied her for a moment, taking in her respectable appearance and well-spoken manner. "That would be a matter for our records department, miss. But I should warn you, we don't typically allow civilians access without proper authorization. What sort of records are you seeking?" Eleanor hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "I am trying to locate information about a woman named Margaret, possibly from the year 1887 or thereabouts. I have reason to believe she may have been involved in some matter that came to the attention of the authorities." The sergeant's expression became more guarded. 1887, you say? That's a fair time ago. And you have only a first name?" "I'm afraid so. But I have a photograph, if that might be helpful." Before the sergeant could respond, a voice spoke from behind Eleanor. "Perhaps I might be of assistance." Eleanor turned to find herself facing a man who appeared to be in his early 30s. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders that filled out his dark suit with an athletic grace. His hair was dark brown, worn slightly longer than fashion dictated, and his eyes were a remarkable shade of blue-gray that seemed to see more than most men's. His face was handsome in a rugged way, with strong features that suggested both intelligence and determination. There was an air of quiet confidence about him, the bearing of someone accustomed to authority but not arrogant in its exercise. "Detective William Ashford," he said, extending his hand. "I happened to overhear your conversation with Sergeant Murphy here. If you're researching historical matters, particularly those from 1887, I may indeed be able to help." That was a significant year in Boston's history, and I have made something of a study of the period. Eleanor took his hand, feeling the firm warmth of his grip. Eleanor Hartford, I would be most grateful for any assistance you could provide. Detective Ashford, I confess I am somewhat at a loss as to where to begin. Why don't we speak in my office? William suggested, gesturing toward a staircase that led to the upper floors. We'll be more comfortable there, and you can show me this photograph you mentioned. Eleanor followed him up the stairs and through a warren of corridors to a small office that overlooked Pemberton Square. The room was modest but orderly, with a desk piled with files and folders, a bookshelf filled with legal volumes and city directories, and a window that let in the pale morning light. William pulled out a chair for Eleanor, then settled himself behind the desk. Now then, Miss Hartford, tell me about this photograph and what you're hoping to discover. Eleanor removed the photograph from her reticule and placed it on the desk between them. William picked it up carefully, studying it with the trained eye of an investigator. She watched his face as he examined the image, noting the way his expression shifted from casual interest to something more intense, more focused. May I ask where you obtained this? He asked quietly. I found it in my grandmother's attic. The woman on the left is my grandmother, Constance Hartford. She passed away recently, and I have been settling her estate. The woman with the baby is identified on the back as Margaret, and the baby is Catherine. The date is given as September 1887. William turned the photograph over and read the inscription. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The truth must be protected, he read aloud. A curious phrase. Indeed. I was hoping you might help me understand what truth my grandmother was referring to and who these people were. William was silent for a long moment, still studying the photograph. When he finally looked up, his eyes met Eleanor's with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. Miss Hartford, I believe I may know something of this matter. But before I say anything further, I must ask, are you prepared to learn things that may change your understanding of your family's history? Sometimes the past contains truths that are difficult to bear. Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine, but her voice was steady when she replied. I am prepared, Detective Ashford. Whatever the truth may be, I would rather know it than live in ignorance. William nodded slowly, as if making a decision. Very well. Then I think we should begin at the beginning, with the year 1887 and a scandal that rocked Boston society. William rose from his chair and moved to the window, his hands clasped behind his back as he gazed out at the square below. Eleanor watched him, noting the tension in his shoulders, the way he seemed to be choosing his words with careful deliberation. The silence stretched between them, filled only with the muted sounds of the police headquarters and the distant clatter of carriage wheels on cobblestones. In 1887, William began, his voice measured and thoughtful, there was a case that my father investigated. He was a detective with this department, one of the most respected officers of his generation. The case involved the disappearance of a young woman named Margaret Sinclair, the daughter of a prominent shipping merchant. She vanished without a trace in early September of that year, and despite an extensive investigation, she was never found. Eleanor felt her heart begin to race. Margaret Sinclair. You believe she is the woman in the photograph? I do. William turned back to face her, and she could see the certainty in his eyes. My father kept detailed notes on all his cases, particularly those that remained unsolved. After he passed away 5 years ago, I inherited his files. I have spent considerable time reviewing them, trying to understand the cases that haunted him, the ones he could never solve. Margaret Sinclair's disappearance was one of those cases. He returned to his desk and opened a drawer, removing a thick folder bound with string. My father believed that Margaret did not simply disappear. He believed she went into hiding, that she was protected by someone with considerable resources and influence. But he could never prove it, and without evidence, the case eventually went cold. Eleanor leaned forward, her fingers gripping the edge of the desk. Why would she need to hide? What was she running from? That is the question that tormented my father for years. William opened the folder and began laying out documents. Police reports, witness statements, newspaper clippings yellowed with age. Margaret Sinclair was 22 years old when she disappeared. She was engaged to be married to a man named Richard Pemberton, the son of another wealthy Boston family. By all accounts, it was a suitable match, one that would unite two powerful families. He paused, selecting a particular document from the pile. But according to my father's notes, there were rumors that Margaret was unhappy with the arrangement. Several witnesses reported seeing her in the company of a married woman, someone she had become close to, someone who seemed to offer her support and friendship. My father believed that this woman helped Margaret escape, that she provided the means and the protection Margaret needed to start a new life away from Boston and away from her unwanted engagement. The realization hit Eleanor like a physical blow. My grandmother. You think my grandmother helped Margaret Sinclair disappear? I do not merely think it, Miss Hartford. I am nearly certain of it. William met her gaze steadily. Your grandmother was known in Boston society as a woman of independent means and strong will. She had no children of her own, but she was known to be generous with her time and resources, particularly toward young women in difficult circumstances. If Margaret Sinclair needed help, Constance Hartford would have been exactly the sort of person who might have provided it. Eleanor sat back in her chair, her mind reeling. The photograph suddenly took on new meaning. Not just a simple portrait of two friends, but evidence of a secret rescue, a conspiracy of compassion that had changed the course of at least one life. And the baby? Little Catherine? William's expression softened. That, Miss Hartford, is perhaps the most important part of the story. According to the rumors that circulated at the time, though never confirmed, Margaret Sinclair was with child when she disappeared. If that was true, then little Catherine would have been Margaret's daughter. But why would that have required such secrecy? Yes, an unmarried woman with a child would have faced scandal, but surely there were other solutions, other ways to handle such a situation. You are quite right, under normal circumstances. But consider the timing, Miss Hartford. Margaret disappeared in early September. If she was with child and if the photograph was taken in late September, as the inscription suggests, then Catherine must have been born before Margaret's disappearance, which means the child could not have been fathered by Richard Pemberton, her fiancé. Eleanor finished, understanding dawning. If Margaret already had a child by another man and tried to proceed with the marriage, it would have been discovered. The scandal would have destroyed not just her reputation, but her entire family's standing in society. Precisely. And more than that, if the true father was someone inappropriate, someone who could not or would not acknowledge the child, then Margaret would have had no good options within the bounds of respectable society. Running away, taking on a new identity with the help of a benefactor like your grandmother, might have been her only choice. Eleanor picked up the photograph again, looking at it with new eyes. Margaret's face seemed different now, not just young and pretty, but brave, determined. A woman who had made an impossible choice to protect her child. And her grandmother, standing beside her, was not merely a friend, but a savior. Someone who had risked her own reputation to help another woman in desperate need. What happened to them? Eleanor asked quietly. To Margaret and Catherine. Did your father ever discover where they went? William shook his head. That is where the trail goes cold. My father suspected they left Boston, possibly went west where they could disappear into a growing city and start fresh. Your grandmother continued to live here, of course, maintaining her position in society, giving no hint that she had been involved in the disappearance. She was questioned, as were many of Margaret's acquaintances, but she told the police nothing. My father respected her for that, even as it frustrated his investigation. A thought occurred to Eleanor. Detective Ashford, why are you telling me all of this? Surely your father's files are confidential. You have no obligation to share this information with me. William was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice held a note of something Eleanor could not quite identify. Because I believe you have a right to know your grandmother's story. Because I think she was a remarkable woman who did a brave thing. And because... He hesitated, then continued. Because I believe this case deserves to be solved, even after all these years. Not to prosecute anyone or bring scandal upon your family, but simply to know the truth, to honor the courage of both Margaret Sinclair and Constance Hartford. Eleanor felt a warmth spread through her chest, a mixture of gratitude and something else, something that made her acutely aware of the man sitting across from her. William Ashford was not just handsome, though he certainly was that. He was intelligent, thoughtful, possessed of a moral compass that guided him toward justice tempered with compassion. She found herself wanting to know more about him, about what had led him to follow in his father's footsteps, about the cases he had solved and the ones that still haunted him. I would like to help you solve it, she heard herself saying. If you are willing to have my assistance, I would very much like to discover what became of Margaret and Catherine, not just for the sake of the mystery, but because I feel I owe it to my grandmother. She spent her life keeping this secret, protecting these women. The least I can do is ensure that her actions are understood and appreciated." William's face broke into a smile, transforming his serious features into something warmer, more approachable. "I was hoping you would say that, Miss Hartford. In truth, I have been looking for an excuse to reopen this investigation for some time now. My superiors are not particularly interested in cold cases from nearly a decade ago, but if you and I were to pursue this as a private matter, in our spare time, I see no reason why we could not make progress." "Then we are partners in this endeavor," Eleanor said, extending her hand across the desk. William took it, his grip firm and steady. "Partners," he agreed, and Eleanor felt a thrill run through her at the word and the promise it contained. They spent the rest of the morning reviewing William's father's files, piecing together the fragments of the case. Eleanor proved to have a sharp eye for details, noticing connections and patterns that William had overlooked in his previous reviews of the material. They discovered that in the weeks before her disappearance, Margaret Sinclair had made several visits to a charity organization that Constance Hartford supported, a home for unwed mothers in the South End of Boston. "That must be where they met," Eleanor said, pointing to a witness statement that mentioned seeing Margaret at the charity home. "My grandmother was involved with that organization for years. I remember her mentioning it in her letters, though she never went into detail about the work they did. And it would have been the perfect place for Margaret to learn about resources available to women in her situation," William added. "Your grandmother could have counseled her, helped her make plans, perhaps even arranged for her confinement and the birth of the child at the charity home, away from prying eyes. But after the birth, Margaret could not return to her old life, not with a baby that everyone would know was not her fiancé's child. So your grandmother helped her disappear, provided money, perhaps even a new identity, and then took this photograph as a memento, a record of what she had done." Eleanor felt tears pricking at her eyes. She must have cared for Margaret very deeply to take such risks, and she kept the secret for the rest of her life, never told anyone what she had done. "She protected them," William said softly, "just as the inscription says. She protected the truth, protected Margaret and Catherine, gave them a chance at a life they could not have had otherwise." They fell silent, both contemplating the story they had uncovered. Eleanor looked at William and saw in his face the same mixture of sadness and admiration that she felt. Here was a man who understood the complexity of justice, who could see beyond the letter of the law to the human truths beneath. She found herself drawn to him in a way that was both thrilling and slightly frightening. "What should we do next?" she asked, breaking the silence. William considered the question. "The charity home still exists, though it operates under a different name now. I have a contact there, a woman named Mrs. Beatrice Walsh, who has been involved with the organization for over 20 years. She might remember Margaret, or at least have access to records from that period. Would you be willing to visit with me tomorrow? 2 people asking questions will be less suspicious than a police detective making official inquiries." "Of course. What time shall I meet you? Would 10 o'clock be suitable? I can call for you at your grandmother's house, if that would be convenient." Eleanor felt her heart flutter at the thought of seeing him again so soon. "That would be perfect, Detective Ashford. Please, call me William. If we are to be partners in this investigation, formality seems unnecessary. Then you must call me Eleanor." She smiled and was pleased to see him return it. They parted ways shortly after, Eleanor making her way back through the busy streets of Boston with the photograph safely tucked in her reticule and her mind whirling with all she had learned. The mystery of the photograph had led her to William Ashford, and together they were uncovering a story of courage and sacrifice that cast her grandmother in an entirely new light. That evening, as Eleanor sat in her grandmother's parlor with a cup of tea growing cold beside her, she examined the photograph once more. Margaret Sinclair looked back at her across the years, a young woman who had faced an impossible situation with bravery, and beside her, Constance Hartford, Eleanor's own grandmother, revealed as a woman of far greater depth and compassion than Eleanor had ever imagined. She thought of William, of the way he had shared his father's files with her, of his commitment to uncovering the truth not for glory or recognition but simply because it mattered. She thought of how his eyes had lit up when she agreed to help him, of the warmth of his smile, of the way her hand had felt in his. There was something growing between them, something that went beyond their shared investigation. She could feel it in the air when they were together, in the way their conversation flowed so naturally, in the comfortable silences that fell between them. Eleanor had never been one to believe in fate or destiny. She was a practical woman, educated and independent, who made her own choices and charted her own course. But standing at the window of her grandmother's house, looking out at the gas-lit street below, she could not help but feel that finding the photograph had been meant to happen. That meeting William Ashford had been meant to happen. That together they were meant to uncover not just the truth about Margaret Sinclair and little Catherine, but perhaps something more, something about themselves and the connection growing between them. The next morning dawned bright and clear, with a crispness in the air that spoke of autumn deepening into winter. Eleanor dressed with particular care, choosing a walking suit of deep burgundy wool with black trim and a hat adorned with a small cluster of autumn leaves. She told herself it was simply a matter of making a good impression at the charity home, but she knew in her heart that she wanted William to see her looking her best. He arrived precisely at 10 o'clock, driving a small carriage pulled by a handsome bay horse. Eleanor watched from the window as he climbed down and approached the door, noting the easy grace of his movements, the way he carried himself with quiet confidence. When the maid showed him into the parlor, Eleanor felt her breath catch at the sight of him in the morning light, his dark hair slightly tousled by the drive, his eyes bright with anticipation. "Good morning, Eleanor," he said, and the sound of her name in his voice sent a shiver of pleasure through her. "Are you ready for our visit to the charity home?" "Quite ready, William. I confess I barely slept last night, thinking about what we might discover." "As did I." He offered his arm, and she took it, feeling the solid strength of him beneath the fabric of his coat. "Mrs. Walsh is expecting us. I sent a note yesterday afternoon, explaining that we were researching the history of charitable organizations in Boston for an academic project." It seemed a plausible enough excuse. They made their way to the carriage, and William helped Eleanor up to the seat before taking his place beside her. As they drove through the streets of Boston, Eleanor was acutely aware of his presence beside her, of the way their arms occasionally brushed when the carriage hit a bump in the road, of the pleasant warmth that radiated from him in the cool morning air. The charity home was located in the South End, in a neighborhood that had seen better days, but still maintained a certain shabby gentility. The building itself was a large brick structure that had once been a private residence, but had been converted to its current purpose. A discreet brass plaque beside the door identified it as the Haven of Hope Charitable Society. Mrs. Beatrice Walsh proved to be a woman in her 50s with iron-gray hair and kind eyes that had seen much suffering but had not lost their compassion. She welcomed them into a small office that smelled of lavender and old paper, gesturing for them to sit in the worn but comfortable chairs arranged before her desk. "Detective Ashford, how lovely to see you again. And you must be Miss Hartford. Your note mentioned an interest in our organization's history. How may I be of assistance?" William glanced at Eleanor, and she saw in his eyes a question. She nodded slightly, giving him permission to proceed. "Mrs. Walsh, we must confess that our interest is somewhat more specific than we indicated in our correspondence. We are investigating the case of a young woman who may have sought assistance from your organization in 1887. Her name was Margaret Sinclair." Mrs. Walsh's expression shifted, becoming more guarded. "That is a very long time ago, Detective. And you know that we do not discuss our clients, past or present. The women who come to us do so in confidence, trusting that their secrets will be kept. We understand and respect that," Eleanor said gently, leaning forward. "But Margaret Sinclair has been missing for 8 years, Mrs. Walsh. Her family never knew what became of her. We are not looking to cause trouble or bring scandal upon anyone. We simply want to know that she is safe, that she found the help she needed." Mrs. Walsh studied them both for a long moment, her weathered hands folded on the desk before her. The silence in the small office was broken only by the distant sounds of the city filtering through the windows and the gentle ticking of a clock on the mantelpiece. Eleanor could see the internal struggle playing across the older woman's face, the conflict between her duty to protect her clients and the compassion that had drawn her to this work in the first place. Finally, Mrs. Walsh rose from her chair and moved to a large cabinet that stood against the far wall. She produced a key from the chain at her waist and unlocked it, revealing shelves packed with leather-bound ledgers and folders tied with ribbon. She ran her finger along the spines, searching, until she found what she was looking for. She pulled out a ledger marked with the year 1887 and returned to her desk, but she did not immediately open it. "Before I show you anything," she said, her voice firm but not unkind, "I need to understand your true intentions. Detective Ashford, you say you simply want to know that Margaret is safe. But why now, after all these years? And Miss Hartford, what is your connection to this matter? Eleanor reached into her reticule and withdrew the photograph, placing it on the desk. The woman standing with Margaret in this photograph is my grandmother, Constance Hartford. She passed away recently, and I found this hidden among her possessions. The inscription on the back suggests that my grandmother was involved in helping Margaret, in protecting her secret. I want to understand what my grandmother did and why. I want to honor her memory by ensuring that her actions were not in vain. Mrs. Walsh picked up the photograph, and Eleanor saw tears spring to her eyes. "Oh my," she whispered. "I remember when this was taken. I was there that day." I had only just started working here, a young woman myself, barely 20 years old. Mrs. Hartford brought Margaret to us in the spring of 1887. She was perhaps 5 months along with child, frightened and desperate. Her family was pressuring her to marry a man she did not love, and she knew that once the pregnancy became obvious, there would be no escaping that fate. "What happened?" William asked gently, his detective's instincts tempered by genuine compassion. Mrs. Walsh opened the ledger, turning pages until she found the entry she sought. "Margaret stayed with us through her confinement. Mrs. Hartford paid all her expenses and visited her regularly, providing not just financial support but emotional comfort as well. The baby, Catherine, was born in late August. She was a beautiful child with dark hair and the most remarkable blue eyes. Margaret adored her, but she knew she could not keep her and return to her old life. The scandal would have destroyed her family." Eleanor felt her throat tighten with emotion. "So my grandmother helped her disappear. But what happened to Catherine?" Mrs. Walsh closed the ledger carefully, her fingers tracing the worn leather cover. "That is the part of the story that few people know. Mrs. Hartford had connections throughout New England, relationships with other charitable organizations and families who might provide homes for children in need. She arranged for Catherine to be placed with a family in Vermont, a good family who had longed for a child but had been unable to have one of their own. They were a physician and his wife, respectable people who would give Catherine every advantage." "And Margaret agreed to this?" Eleanor asked, unable to imagine the pain of such a decision. "She did, though it broke her heart. But she understood that it was the best chance for Catherine to have a normal life, free from the stigma that would have followed her otherwise. Mrs. Hartford promised Margaret that she would ensure Catherine was well cared for, that she would check on her periodically through her network of contacts. And she kept that promise for many years." William leaned forward, his expression intent. "And Margaret herself? Where did she go?" Mrs. Hartford arranged passage for her on a train heading west. She provided her with enough money to start a new life, letters of introduction to people who might help her find respectable employment, and a new name. Margaret became Mary Sinclair, a widow from Boston seeking a fresh start. The last we heard, she had settled in San Francisco and was working as a teacher in a girls' school. Eleanor felt a wave of admiration for her grandmother sweep over her. Constance Hartford had not simply helped a young woman in trouble. She had orchestrated an entire rescue, carefully planning every detail to give both Margaret and Catherine the best possible futures. It must have required considerable resources, not just financial but also social connections, courage, and unwavering commitment. "Mrs. Walsh," Eleanor said softly, "do you know if Margaret and Catherine ever saw each other again?" The older woman's eyes grew sad. "Not that I am aware of. It was better that way, you understand. If they had maintained contact, there would always have been the risk of discovery, of the truth coming out." Mrs. Hartford believed that a clean break, though painful, was the kindest thing for everyone involved. William spoke up, his voice thoughtful. "You said Mrs. Hartford checked on Catherine periodically. Do you know if she continued to do so in recent years? And do you have any information about where Catherine might be now?" Mrs. Walsh hesitated, then nodded slowly. "I do have some information, though it is somewhat dated. Mrs. Hartford last inquired about Catherine approximately 2 years ago. At that time, Catherine was still living with her adoptive family in Vermont. She would have been about 8 years old. The physician and his wife had given her their surname, Bennett, and she was reportedly thriving, a bright and happy child who excelled in her studies." Eleanor felt tears streaming down her cheeks, though she was not entirely sure why she was crying. Perhaps it was relief that the story had a happy ending, or perhaps it was grief for all the pain and sacrifice that had been necessary to achieve it, or perhaps it was simply the overwhelming emotion of discovering that her grandmother, whom she had thought she barely knew, had been a woman of such extraordinary compassion and courage. William reached over and gently touched her hand, a gesture of comfort that sent warmth coursing through her. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. She nodded, accepting the handkerchief he offered and dabbing at her eyes. "Yes, I am. It is just so much to take in. My grandmother lived with this secret for so many years, never speaking of it, never seeking recognition for what she had done. She simply acted because it was the right thing to do. She was a remarkable woman," Mrs. Walsh agreed. "And she was not the only one. There were others like her, women of means and influence who used their positions to help those less fortunate, who worked quietly behind the scenes to provide aid and comfort. The world is a better place because of women like Constance Hartford." They spent another hour with Mrs. Walsh, learning more about the charity home and the work it continued to do. Eleanor promised to make a substantial donation in her grandmother's memory, and William obtained permission to review the ledgers more thoroughly, should they need additional information for their investigation. As they prepared to leave, Mrs. Walsh called them back. "There is one more thing you should know," she said, reaching into a drawer of her desk. "Mrs. Hartford left something with us many years ago. She said that if anyone ever came asking the right questions, if anyone showed genuine interest in understanding what had happened to Margaret and Catherine, we were to give them this." She withdrew a sealed envelope, yellowed with age, and handed it to Eleanor. She must have known that someday someone would find the photograph and come searching for answers. Perhaps she even hoped it would be you. Eleanor took the envelope with trembling hands. Her name was written on the front in her grandmother's distinctive script. For Eleanor, should she ever seek the truth. The sight of it made her heart ache with longing for the relationship she and her grandmother had never quite managed to build in life. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for keeping this safe, for honoring my grandmother's wishes." They made their farewells and returned to the carriage. As William guided the horse through the crowded streets, Eleanor sat in silence, the envelope clutched in her hands. She was both eager to read its contents and afraid of what she might discover. William seemed to sense her internal struggle and did not press her, allowing her the space to process her emotions. Finally, as they approached Beacon Hill, Eleanor broke the silence. "William, would you come inside? I would like to read this letter, but I find I do not want to be alone when I do. Would you stay with me?" He turned to look at her, and she saw in his eyes something that made her breath catch. It was not just concern or compassion, though both were there. It was something deeper, more personal. A warmth that spoke of feelings that went beyond their partnership in solving this mystery. "Of course," he said simply. "I would be honored." They entered the townhouse and Eleanor led William to the parlor. The maid brought tea, but it sat untouched as Eleanor carefully broke the seal on the envelope and withdrew several sheets of paper covered in her grandmother's elegant handwriting. She began to read aloud, her voice wavering at first but growing stronger as she continued. "My dearest Eleanor, if you are reading this letter, then you have found the photograph and sought to understand its significance. I am glad. I have kept this secret for so long, carried it alone, and there is a relief in knowing that someone will finally understand what I did and why. Margaret Sinclair came into my life at a time when I was questioning the purpose of my own existence. I was a wealthy widow with no children, no real obligations beyond the maintenance of my social position. I was comfortable but unfulfilled, aware that my life, for all its privileges, lacked meaning." Eleanor paused, glancing at William. He nodded encouragingly, and she continued reading. "Meeting Margaret changed everything. Here was a young woman facing an impossible situation through no real fault of her own. She had fallen in love with the wrong man, a married man who could not acknowledge her or their child. Society would have destroyed her for this, would have labeled her a fallen woman and cast her out. But I saw in Margaret not a sinner, but a human being deserving of compassion and help. I decided that if I could do nothing else with my wealth and position, I could at least save one person from the cruelty of social judgment." The letter went on to describe the months of planning, the careful arrangements, the network of people Constance had enlisted to help. She wrote about the day Catherine was born, about holding the tiny infant in her arms and understanding for the first time the fierce protective love a mother feels for her child. She wrote about the agony of separating Margaret from Catherine, of watching a young mother say goodbye to her baby, knowing it was for the best but feeling the wrongness of it in every fiber of her being. "I have watched over Catherine from a distance over the years," the letter continued. "I have ensured that she wants for nothing, that her adoptive parents have the resources they need to give her every advantage. She is a bright, happy child who will grow up believing herself to be the beloved daughter of Dr. and Mrs. Bennett. She will never know the circumstances of her birth, never know that her mother sacrificed everything to give her a chance at a normal life. And perhaps that is as it should be. Eleanor's voice broke, and she had to pause to compose herself. William moved closer, and she felt the warmth of his presence, solid and comforting beside her. As for Margaret, I have had occasional word of her over the years. She has made a good life for herself in San Francisco. She never married, devoted herself instead to teaching and to helping other young women avoid the fate she so narrowly escaped. She has found peace, I think, or at least acceptance, and she knows that Catherine is safe and loved, which is all any mother can truly ask for. The letter concluded with words that brought fresh tears to Eleanor's eyes. If you have read this far, my dear Eleanor, then you know my secret. You know that your respectable grandmother was once part of a conspiracy that violated the laws and social conventions of our time. I hope you will not think less of me for it. I hope instead that you will understand that sometimes the right thing to do is not the legal thing or the socially acceptable thing, but simply the human thing. I hope that you too will find ways to use whatever advantages you possess to help those in need. And I hope that in learning this truth about me, you might come to know me in a way we never quite managed when I was alive. With all my love, your grandmother, Constance Hartford. Eleanor carefully folded the letter and sat in silence, overwhelmed by the weight of what she had learned. William remained beside her, not speaking, simply offering his presence as comfort. After a long moment, Eleanor turned to him, and their eyes met with an intensity that seemed to charge the very air between them. "Thank you," she said softly. "Thank you for helping me discover this, for leading me to understand who my grandmother truly was. I feel as though I have been given a precious gift, the chance to know her in a way I never did before." "It was my privilege," William replied, his voice low and warm. "But Eleanor, you should know that this investigation has given me something as well. It has given me the chance to complete my father's work, to bring closure to a case that haunted him. And more than that," he hesitated, then continued, his gaze never leaving hers, "it has given me the chance to know you, and that I find matters to me far more than I ever expected it would." Eleanor felt her heart racing, her skin flushing with warmth. "William, She struggled to find words for the feeling swirling within her, the attraction that had been growing since the moment they met, the sense of connection that went beyond their shared investigation. Before she could continue, William reached out and gently took her hand in his. "Eleanor, I know we have known each other only a few days. I know that by all conventional standards, this is far too soon. But I have learned from my work as a detective that life is unpredictable, that opportunities for happiness are rare and precious. And I truly believe, that finding you, working with you on this case, has been one of those rare opportunities." Eleanor squeezed his hand, her voice barely above a whisper. "I feel it too, William. From the moment we met, I have felt drawn to you in a way I cannot fully explain. You are intelligent and kind, principled but compassionate. You see beyond the surface of things to the deeper truths beneath, and you have helped me understand my grandmother's story with such respect and care." They sat together in the fading afternoon light, hands clasped, the letter resting in Eleanor's lap. The mystery that had brought them together was solved, the truth uncovered and understood. But Eleanor realized that solving one mystery had led them to the threshold of another, one that involved their own hearts and the future they might build together. The days following their discovery of Constance Hartford's letter brought a subtle but profound shift in the relationship between Eleanor and William. They continued to meet daily, ostensibly to tie up the remaining threads of their investigation, but both knew that their time together had become about something far more personal than solving a decades-old mystery. The autumn deepened around them, painting Boston in shades of amber and crimson, and Eleanor found herself seeing the city through new eyes, as if William's presence had transformed the familiar streets into something magical and full of promise. On a particularly crisp morning, William arrived at the townhouse with news that sent Eleanor's heart racing. "I have been thinking," he said as they sat in the parlor with cups of tea steaming before them, "about Catherine Bennett. She would be 10 years old now, living in Vermont with her adoptive parents. Your grandmother's letter mentioned that she had ensured the family had resources, but I wonder if there might be more we could do. Would you consider making the journey to Vermont to see for ourselves that Catherine is well and perhaps establish a connection that could continue into the future? Eleanor had been thinking along similar lines. I would very much like to do that. My grandmother devoted so much of her life to protecting Catherine and ensuring her well-being. It seems only right that I should continue that legacy. But William, would you accompany me? I confess I do not wish to make such a journey alone, and your presence would be both a comfort and a practical advantage. The Bennets might be more willing to speak candidly with a detective present to vouch for the legitimacy of our interest. William's face lit up with a smile that made Eleanor's pulse quicken. I was hoping you would ask. I have already spoken with my superior about taking several days of personal leave. He was not entirely pleased, but he could not refuse. We could take the train to Burlington tomorrow morning, if that would suit you. The journey will take most of a day, but I have sent a telegram to Dr. Bennett informing him of our intended visit and explaining, in careful terms, that we have information regarding Catherine's origins that we believe they should hear. They spent the remainder of that day making preparations. Eleanor packed a small traveling case with appropriate clothing for several days away from Boston, her heart fluttering with a mixture of anticipation and nervousness. She would be traveling alone with William, unchaperoned, which was not entirely proper by society's standards. But Eleanor had never been one to be overly concerned with propriety when it conflicted with what she knew to be right, and everything about being with William felt right in a way she had never experienced before. The next morning dawned cold and clear, with frost sparkling on the cobblestones and the promise of winter in the air. William arrived in a hired carriage that would take them to the train station, and as he helped Eleanor up to the seat, his hand lingered on hers for just a moment longer than necessary. Their eyes met, and Eleanor saw in his gaze a warmth and tenderness that made her feel as though she were the most precious thing in his world. The train station was a marvel of modern engineering, all steel and glass and steam, filled with the bustle of travelers and the calls of conductors announcing departures. William secured them a private compartment for the journey, a small enclosed space with facing benches upholstered in dark green velvet, and a window that looked out over the passing landscape. As the train pulled out of the station with a great hiss of steam and the rhythmic clatter of wheels on rails, Eleanor felt a sense of adventure unlike anything she had known before. They talked for hours as the train carried them north through Massachusetts and into Vermont, the conversation flowing easily between topics both profound and mundane. William told her about his childhood, about growing up as the son of a respected detective and feeling the weight of expectation to follow in his father's footsteps. He spoke of cases he had solved and those that still eluded him, of the satisfaction of bringing criminals to justice, but also of the complexity of human nature that made simple judgments impossible. Eleanor shared her own story of growing up in Providence as the only child of parents who had died when she was young, leaving her to be raised primarily by governesses and tutors. She spoke of her education, unusual for a woman of her time, and of her determination to live a life of purpose and meaning, rather than simply making an advantageous marriage and settling into comfortable domesticity. I have always felt that there must be more to life than what society prescribes for us, she said, gazing out at the landscape rolling past the window. My grandmother understood that, I think. She lived according to her own principles, used her resources to make a real difference in people's lives. I want to do the same, to find ways to help others, to contribute something meaningful to the world. William reached across the space between them and took her hand, a gesture that was becoming increasingly natural between them. You already do that, Eleanor. Your compassion, your intelligence, your willingness to look beyond the surface to understand the deeper truths, these are gifts that will touch many lives. And if you will permit me to say so, you have certainly touched mine. Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes, but they were tears of happiness rather than sadness. You have changed my life as well, William. When I found that photograph, I thought I was simply seeking to understand a mystery about my grandmother's past. I never imagined that it would lead me to you, to this connection we have forged. It feels as though finding that photograph was meant to happen, as though everything has been leading to this moment. The train arrived in Burlington in the late afternoon, as the sun was beginning to sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. They took rooms at a respectable hotel near the station, on separate floors to maintain propriety. though Eleanor found herself wishing they did not have to part, even for the night. They dined together in the hotel restaurant, a quiet meal during which they spoke little but communicated volumes through glances and small gestures, the brush of fingers as William passed her the salt, the way his eyes followed her every movement. The next morning, they hired a carriage to take them to the Bennett residence, which was located several miles outside of town in a pleasant rural area. The house was a substantial white farmhouse with black shutters and a wide porch, surrounded by well-tended grounds that spoke of prosperity and care. Smoke rose from the chimney, and chickens scratched in the yard, giving the place a warm, homely feeling that immediately put Eleanor at ease. Dr. Bennett himself answered their knock, a man in his early 40s with graying hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. He invited them into a comfortable parlor where a fire crackled in the hearth, and his wife, a pleasant woman with a gentle smile, served them tea and fresh-baked cookies. Catherine was at school, they explained, but would return shortly. "Your telegram was quite mysterious, Detective Ashford," Dr. Bennett said once they were all seated. "You mentioned having information about our daughter's origins. I confess we have always been open with Catherine about the fact that she came to us through adoption, but we know very little about her birth family. We were told only that her mother was a young woman of good family who could not keep her, and that a benefactor had arranged for her placement with us." Eleanor leaned forward, her hands clasped in her lap. "That benefactor was my grandmother, Constance Hartford of Boston. She passed away recently, and in settling her estate, I discovered evidence of her involvement in Catherine's adoption. Dr. Bennett, Mrs. Bennett, I want to assure you that we have not come here to disrupt your family or to make any claims on Catherine. She is your daughter in every way that matters. We simply wanted to share with you what we have learned about her history, and perhaps, if you are willing, to maintain a connection that would honor my grandmother's memory and ensure that Catherine always knows she has extended family who care about her welfare." Mrs. Bennett's eyes filled with tears. "That is very kind of you, Miss Hartford. We have loved Catherine as our own since the moment she came to us as a tiny baby. She is the light of our lives, and we would do anything to protect her and ensure her happiness. To know that there are others who care about her, who want to be part of her life in a positive way, is a gift beyond measure." William added, "We have also learned the identity of Catherine's birth mother, though we understand this information must be shared carefully and only when the time is right. Her name was Margaret Sinclair, and she made the difficult decision to place Catherine for adoption out of love, wanting to give her a chance at a life free from scandal and hardship. She went on to build a new life for herself in San Francisco, where she has devoted herself to teaching and helping other young women." Dr. Bennett nodded thoughtfully. "Catherine has asked questions about her birth mother as she has grown older. We have always told her that her mother must have loved her very much to make such a difficult choice. It will mean a great deal to her to have a name, to know that her mother is alive and has made a good life for herself." They talked for another hour, sharing the details of the story that Eleanor and William had uncovered, carefully omitting the more scandalous aspects but conveying the essential truth of love and sacrifice that had shaped Catherine's existence. The Bennetts listened with rapt attention, occasionally asking questions, and Eleanor could see that they were genuinely moved by what they were hearing. It was late morning when they heard the sound of a carriage in the drive and then light footsteps on the porch. The door burst open, and a young girl came rushing in, her cheeks flushed from the cold and her dark hair escaping from its braids. She stopped short when she saw the visitors, suddenly shy, but her remarkable blue eyes, so like those Eleanor had seen in the photograph of Margaret, were bright with curiosity. "Catherine, dear, come and meet Miss Hartford and Detective Ashford," Mrs. Bennett said warmly. "They have come all the way from Boston to visit us." Catherine approached with the natural grace of a child who is loved and confident, executing a polite curtsy that made Eleanor smile. "How do you do?" she said, her voice clear and sweet. "Have you really come from Boston? I have read about Boston in my books. Is it very grand?" Eleanor felt her heart swell with emotion as she looked at this bright, happy child who was the result of so much love and sacrifice. "It is quite grand, yes, with many tall buildings and busy streets. But I think Vermont is lovely as well, especially your home here. Your parents have told me how well you are doing in school. You must be a very diligent student." Catherine's face lit up. "Oh, I do love school, especially reading and history. Papa says that education is the most important thing, that it opens doors and creates opportunities. He says that is especially true for girls, that we must work twice as hard to prove ourselves in a world that does not always value our minds. William caught Eleanor's eye, and she saw in his expression the same admiration she felt. Here was a child who was being raised with progressive values, who was being taught to think and question and aspire to more than society might typically expect of a young woman. Constance Hartford's careful selection of adoptive parents had ensured that Catherine would grow up with advantages that went far beyond material comfort. They spent a pleasant hour with Catherine, listening to her chatter about her studies and her friends, watching her show them drawings she had made and books she was reading. Eleanor felt a profound connection to this child who was, in a sense, her grandmother's legacy, a living testament to the power of compassion and courage. When it was time for them to leave, Catherine surprised Eleanor by throwing her arms around her in an impulsive hug. "Will you come back and visit us again?" she asked, looking up at Eleanor with those striking blue eyes. "I would like that very much. I do not have any aunts or uncles, and it would be nice to have more family." Eleanor hugged her back, feeling tears threaten once more. "I will certainly visit again, dear Catherine, and perhaps when you are a bit older, you might come to Boston to stay with me for a time. Would you like that?" "Oh, yes. That would be wonderful." As they drove away from the Bennett home, Eleanor and William sat in companionable silence, both processing the emotions of the visit. Finally, William spoke. "She is a remarkable child. Your grandmother chose well when she selected the Bennetts to raise her. Catherine has everything she needs to thrive: love, education, stability, and values that will serve her well throughout her life." "Yes," Eleanor agreed softly. "My grandmother's greatest achievement was not her wealth or her social position, but this, ensuring that one child had the chance to grow up happy and loved, free from the stigma that might otherwise have defined her life. It makes me think about what truly matters, about how we measure the worth of a life. My grandmother will be remembered by Boston society as a wealthy widow who supported various charities. But her real legacy is Catherine, and perhaps others like her, whom we may never know about." They returned to Burlington and spent one more night at the hotel before beginning the journey back to Boston the following morning. That evening, after dinner, William asked Eleanor to walk with him despite the cold. They strolled through the quiet streets of the town, their breath-forming clouds in the frigid air, until they came to a small park overlooking Lake Champlain. The water was dark and still, reflecting the first stars beginning to appear in the deepening twilight. William turned to face Eleanor, taking both her hands in his. "Eleanor, these past days with you have been the happiest I have known. Working with you to solve this mystery, learning about your grandmother's remarkable story, meeting Catherine and seeing the results of such selfless love, all of it has shown me what life could be like with the right partner beside me. Someone who shares my values, who understands that justice is not always found in the letter of the law, but in the deeper truths of human compassion and dignity." Eleanor's heart was pounding so hard she was certain William must be able to hear it. "William, I feel the same way. You have opened my eyes to so many things, about my grandmother, about the world, about myself. You see people not as types or categories, but as individuals, each with their own story, their own struggles and triumphs. That is a rare gift, and being with you has made me want to be a better person, to use whatever advantages I have to make a real difference in the world." William reached up to cup her face gently in his hands, his touch warm despite the cold. "Eleanor Hartford, I know this is happening quickly, perhaps too quickly by conventional standards, but I also know that life is precious and uncertain, that opportunities for real happiness are rare. I have fallen in love with you, deeply and completely. And if you will have me, if you feel even a fraction of what I feel for you, I would be honored to spend my life by your side, building a future together, carrying on the work your grandmother started, making the world a little better, one person at a time." Tears were streaming down Eleanor's face now, but they were tears of pure joy. "Oh, William, I do love you. I have loved you almost from the moment we met, though I hardly dared admit it even to myself. Yes, 1,000 times yes, I will marry you. I want nothing more than to build a life with you, to be your partner in every sense of the word." William pulled her close, and Eleanor went willingly into his arms, feeling the solid strength of him, the warmth of his embrace chasing away the cold of the November evening. They stood together in the gathering darkness, two people who had been brought together by a mystery from the past, and who would now create their own story, their own legacy of love and purpose. When they finally drew apart, William reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. "I know this is presumptuous," he said with a slightly sheepish smile, "but I purchased this yesterday in Burlington, hoping that I might have the courage to ask you and that you might say yes." He opened the box to reveal a simple but elegant ring, a sapphire surrounded by small diamonds that caught the lamplight and sparkled like stars. Eleanor gasped. "William, it is beautiful. Perfect." He slipped it onto her finger, and it fit as if it had been made for her. They kissed then, a long, tender kiss that sealed their commitment to each other and to the future they would build together. When they finally made their way back to the hotel, Eleanor felt as though she were walking on air, her hand clasped in William's, the ring on her finger a tangible symbol of the love they shared. The journey back to Boston the next day was entirely different from the trip north. Where before there had been the tentative exploration of two people getting to know each other, now there was the easy intimacy of an engaged couple, the freedom to speak openly of their hopes and dreams for the future. They talked about where they would live, deciding that Eleanor's grandmother's townhouse on Beacon Hill would be perfect once some renovations were made to suit both their tastes. They discussed how Eleanor might continue her grandmother's charitable work, perhaps expanding the Haven of Hope or establishing new programs to help women in difficult circumstances. William spoke of his work with the police department and his hope that Eleanor might occasionally assist him with investigations, particularly those involving women or children who might be more comfortable speaking with her than with a male detective. Eleanor was thrilled at the prospect, seeing it as a way to use her intelligence and compassion in practical service while also remaining closely involved in William's professional life. By the time they arrived back in Boston, they had sketched out the broad outlines of a life together that excited them both, a partnership of equals working toward common goals while supporting each other's individual ambitions and interests. They decided to have a short engagement, agreeing that there was no reason to wait when they were both certain of their feelings. They would marry in the spring, in a simple ceremony at the church Eleanor's grandmother had attended, with Catherine Bennett and her parents invited as honored guests. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Eleanor had to complete the settlement of her grandmother's estate, and she did so with a new sense of purpose, ensuring that Constance's charitable commitments were honored and expanded. She donated generously to the Haven of Hope in her grandmother's memory and established a scholarship fund for young women seeking education, to be administered by Mrs. Walsh and her organization. William introduced Eleanor to his colleagues at the police department, and while there were some raised eyebrows at the idea of a woman involving herself in detective work, William's reputation and Eleanor's obvious intelligence won over most skeptics. She began to assist informally with cases, particularly those involving missing persons or families in crisis, and quickly proved her value with her ability to connect with people and draw out information that might otherwise remain hidden. News of their engagement spread through Boston society, and while there was some gossip about the speed of their courtship, most people approved of the match. William was respected for his integrity and skill as a detective, and Eleanor was admired as the granddaughter of the formidable Constance Hartford. The two of them together seemed to embody a new kind of partnership, one that transcended traditional gender roles and pointed toward a more progressive future. On a cold December evening, as Eleanor and William sat together in the parlor of the Beacon Hill townhouse, reviewing plans for their wedding, Eleanor found herself thinking about the photograph that had started it all. It sat now in a place of honor on the mantelpiece, Margaret and Constance frozen in that moment of friendship and conspiracy, little Catherine in her mother's arms. "Do you think we should try to contact Margaret?" Eleanor asked William. "She is Catherine's birth mother, after all. Perhaps she would like to know how well Catherine is doing, to have some assurance that the sacrifice she made was worth it." William considered the question carefully. "I think that would be a kindness, though it must be handled delicately. Margaret built a new life for herself in San Francisco, free from the past. We would not want to cause her distress or reopen old wounds. Perhaps a letter, letting her know that Catherine is thriving, loved and happy, being raised by good people who value education and character. We need not press for a reunion or any ongoing contact unless Margaret herself expresses a desire for it." Eleanor nodded in agreement. "That seems wise. And perhaps someday, when Catherine is older and can understand the full story, she might choose to seek out her birth mother. But that should be her decision to make in her own time." They fell silent, both lost in thought, until William spoke again. You know, when I first became a detective, I thought justice was simple. There were criminals and victims, right and wrong, law and disorder. But working on cases like this one, learning about your grandmother's choices and the complexity of Margaret's situation, has taught me that justice is far more nuanced. Sometimes the right thing to do is not the legal thing. Sometimes protecting the innocent requires bending or breaking rules. Your grandmother understood that, and I hope I am learning to understand it as well. Eleanor reached over and took his hand. We will figure it out together, William. We will do our best to help people, to bring some measure of justice and compassion to a world that often has too little of either. And we will do it as partners, supporting each other, learning from each other, growing together. As Christmas approached, Eleanor and William made one final journey together before their wedding, returning to Vermont to spend the holiday with the Bennetts and Catherine. It was a joyful visit, filled with laughter and warmth, with Catherine delighting in having so many people gathered to celebrate. On Christmas Eve, as they all sat around the fire listening to Catherine read aloud from A Christmas Carol, Eleanor caught William's eye across the room and felt a surge of gratitude for everything that had brought them to this moment. The mystery of the photograph had been solved, the truth uncovered and honored. Margaret Sinclair had been given the chance to start anew in San Francisco, where she continued to help young women avoid the fate she had narrowly escaped. Catherine Bennett was growing up loved and cherished, with a bright future ahead of her, and Eleanor and William had found in each other the perfect partner, someone who shared their values and their vision for a life of meaning and purpose. In the spring of 1896, on a perfect April morning when the air was soft and the trees were budding with new life, Eleanor Hartford married William Ashford in a simple ceremony attended by close friends and family. Catherine Bennett served as Eleanor's flower girl, carrying a basket of spring blossoms and beaming with happiness. Mrs. Walsh from the Haven of Hope was there, tears streaming down her face as she witnessed the union of two people who had been brought together by their mutual commitment to uncovering truth and honoring the memory of a remarkable woman. As they exchanged their vows, promising to love and honor each other for all their days, Eleanor thought of her grandmother and silently thanked her. Finding that photograph in the attic had been the beginning of an extraordinary journey, one that had led Eleanor not just to understand her grandmother's secret, but to find her own path, her own purpose, and her own great love. The reception was held at the Beacon Hill townhouse, which Eleanor and William would now share as their home. As evening fell and the last guests departed, they stood together at the window overlooking the street, much as Eleanor had stood alone on that rainy October evening months before. But everything was different now. She was no longer alone, no longer searching for answers. She had found her partner, her love, and together they would write their own story, building on the foundation of courage and compassion that Constance Hartford had laid. "What are you thinking?" William asked softly, his arm around her waist. Eleanor leaned into him, feeling perfectly content. "I am thinking that finding that photograph was the greatest gift my grandmother could have given me. It led me to understand her, to meet Catherine, and most importantly, it led me to you. I am thinking that our story is just beginning, and I cannot wait to see where it takes us." William kissed her temple gently. "Wherever it takes us, we will face it together. That is all that matters." And as the spring twilight deepened into night, Eleanor and William Ashford stood together in their home, partners in every sense of the word, ready to build a life dedicated to justice, compassion, and love. The photograph on the mantelpiece bore silent witness to their happiness, a reminder of the secrets and sacrifices of the past that had made their present joy possible, and a promise that they would honor that legacy by living lives of purpose and meaning, just as Constance Hartford had done before them. The truth had been uncovered and protected, just as the inscription had promised, and in protecting that truth, they had found their own truth, that love, when combined with shared values and mutual respect, could overcome any obstacle and create a future brighter than either of them had dared to imagine.